This next section is going to focus on the menstrual cycle, and by menstrual cycle we mean your full cycle, not just the bleed. So here is an example of what you would see in a normal cycle. Now, getting into things real quick, you've probably been thinking about your chart in terms of a calendar. I want you to try to forget doing that because your calendar happens in a cycle, not in terms of a linear graph or something like that, okay? So the first section is going to be menstruation. We know what that is. A woman will have a bleed because she doesn't have, her estrogen levels have basically fallen to a certain point, and that causes the breakdown of the endometrium. So we have a menstruation. Then we have what's called the basic infertile pattern, or as we call it, the BIP. So if I'm going to say BIP a lot in this training, I mean this part of the cycle, after menstruation, before fertility. This is a time where a woman will feel dry, or she'll feel the presence of some moisture, but nothing significant. Now, we're going to go into this a little bit later, so please don't be confused. But what you need to know is it's an infertile time after menstruation, but before fertility. Then she's going to go into a time of fertility. This is where she's going to have a changing developing pattern. She's going to have more and more days of discharge. She's going to have a sensation other than dry, and she'll get to a point where she's very wet and slippery. Now, I'm going to tell you about what peak is later, but that will culminate with a peak day, the day at which she's most fertile. Then you're going to have 3 days of fertility right after that. Okay. And then after that phase, you will have an infertile time again, starting on the 4th day post-peak, going to the end of the cycle. Okay, so again, possibly fertile, infertile, fertile, infertile. Okay, so that's how the menstrual cycle will actually go. It starts off with menstruation, so think about the pinwheel every time we go through these slides. The sensation that the vulva is wet. So again, when we say sensation, it's how you feel walking around conducting normal activities. We're not talking about a wiping sensation or the feeling of drainage coming down the vagina. So don't chart the feeling of something coming out. I want you to chart how you feel at the vulva. So it's external. Okay, estrogen and progesterone are low at this time. And the mucus plug does not exist. There's a mucus plug that exists ensuring infertility during certain parts of the cycle, but at this part it's not there because, at this timing of the cycle, it's not there because it's allowing the menstrual flow to happen. So now we go into that second part of the pinwheel where you're infertile. This is the BIP. You're going to be either dry, meaning you feel nothing and you see nothing on these days, or you might have the presence of discharge. That could be either a dry sensation where you feel nothing and you see something, or it could be you feel something and you see something. We'll define that a little bit later. What you need to know about this time is that the sensation at the vulva is going to be dry for a gal with a dry BIP. Nothing is going to be seen. You won't be doing any internal investigation, so please don't try to look for mucus. If you look in the vagina, it's always somewhat moist, so you're going to fake yourself out. Estrogen is low at this time, and that's what you need to know. Okay, and you've got this thick mucus plug that ensures infertility. Okay? Because you have the mucus plug in place, sperm cannot enter, and therefore it is an infertile time of the cycle. All right, now we get into the other gal. This is still the BIP, but it's the gal that never has dry days. This might be you. Okay, so same exact thing is happening for her. The only reason why she feels something or sees something is because sometimes the bottom of the plug will kind of drip. So if that's the case, then she's going to see discharge maybe on her underwear or on the toilet paper, or she might even feel a presence of moisture. When Marianne and I first started charting, our BIP was dry. Later on, over the years, it changed to a moist BIP. So we define our BIP right now as a moist sensation with like a dried discharge on her underwear. Estrogen at this time is also low. Mucus plug is in place. Sperm have nowhere to go. She is infertile, just like the dry gal. Now, no matter what type of gal you are, you're going to get to a day where you enter fertility. So something changes. So what happens? So you're going to feel the presence of discharge. Okay, you're going to see the discharge. You'll feel the sensation of something other than dry, most likely. Estrogen is starting to rise at this time. The mucus plug is freed, which allows the mucus to flow to the vulva. And this is why we have a change in sensation. Sperm now can enter. You might not be ovulating on a day like this, but that doesn't mean you can't get pregnant. Sperm can live for up to 5 days, and I'll talk about that later. You're going to go through what we call a changing developing pattern. During this time, you're going to become more and more fertile. The mucus will become more and more fluid. Usually it will change in color, it will get more and more clear, but the fluidity of the mucus is much more important than the color of the mucus. Okay, it will eventually progress to a slippery sensation. Now, when I say slippery sensation, you're going to feel totally saturated, like walking around, you want to change, you just feel gross. Okay, and on a day of slippery, your labia will feel like they're kind of just gliding together. That's how you'd feel. Estrogen is still rising at this point, and your cervix is producing more and more fluid. Okay, or more mucus that's more fluid by nature. Now, sperm can live for up to 3 to 5 days. I just mentioned that a second ago, so you're still fertile during this time. You're going to get to what we call peak, which is defined as the last day of slippery sensation. Okay, the sensation at the vulva is going to be slippery at this time. It may be soft, swollen, or something like that. Marianne can actually notice the swollen sensation on these days. Estrogen has peaked by this point and is actually falling, but progesterone is beginning to rise on the day of peak. Okay, so you're very close to ovulation. Ovulation will usually occur on peak day, but sometimes can occur up to 2 days after. So don't think that peak equals ovulation, but if you do have a peak on your chart, what you can say is, I definitely did ovulate. I'm just not exactly sure which day that happened. Okay, we'll talk about that probably the next session, our first in-person session. Okay. Skip over that. After peak, the same thing will occur in reverse. The mucus plug will reform. So we can kind of see that down here at the bottom. Okay, it will take 3 days for that to happen. Now, the reason why you notice that you have a peak is because you're going to have an abrupt change in sensation. And that, again, is due to the pockets of Shaw. Once progesterone starts to rise, these things activate, and they withdraw the moisture coming from the mucus. So the mucus is coming down the vagina, passes through the pockets of Shaw, and is dried up in the process. Some might make it to the vulva, but you're going to feel totally different on the day after peak than you would the day before. So on that day of peak, you're going to feel very wet, have that slippery sensation. The day afterwards, you might be completely dry or maybe just damp or moist, something like that. So you're going to have an abrupt change. Ovulation has occurred at this point or will occur within the next day. And progesterone is rising. So we have ovulation most likely. Okay, and I just mentioned the pockets of Shaw. Sometimes I get ahead of myself. The cervix, as I mentioned, is beginning to close, so you're becoming less and less fertile, but you are still very fertile at this time. An active intercourse on the day after peak or the second day after peak is a very fertile day. Okay, so the same thing will continue here. By the third day after peak, you've definitely ovulated at that point. The sensation may change. You might be dry one day, moist the next day. Doesn't matter so long as you are not wet or slippery. Progesterone and estrogen are rising at this time. The egg is present up to 3 days after peak. By the 4th day, it will not be there any longer. And again, that mucus plug is closing, but the sperm have avenues. They still have channels of mucus that they can travel through. But by that 4th day after peak, you're now infertile again. The mucus plug is in place, and the sperm have nowhere to go. The sensation can be variable. So a gal with a dry BIP might not be totally dry during her luteal phase. That's okay, she's still infertile. Okay. Now after ovulation, the empty follicle becomes the corpus luteum. That's Latin for yellow body. It secretes both estrogen and progesterone. At this point, the egg has disintegrated, so you cannot conceive if you haven't already gotten pregnant. Okay, and again, as I mentioned, the cervix is completely closed up. And then the cycle will end with the new menstruation. So if you're not pregnant, this is going to be the result. And that is what happens in a normal fertile cycle. Now, ovulation is the main event of the cycle. So I want you to look at these different lines here. They represent different lengths of cycles. All of these are fully ovulatory, meaning she ovulated on every single one of these. So she would have had a peak on every single one of these. Now keep in mind the time after peak here is always very consistent, 11 to 16 days. Okay. However, the time beforehand is variable. And really the variable time of the cycle is the BIP. So again, menstruation, BIP, fertility, and infertility, luteal phase. So this is a time that will change. You could have 6 days here and then 5 days the next cycle. Here she has no days of BIP. She goes straight from bleeding right into fertility. Here, maybe another 6 days. And then here, maybe 10 days. So if this is longer, ovulation will be delayed. If it's shorter or non-existent, ovulation will happen early. But just keep in mind, we always wait for ovulation to happen. We don't assume it definitely will.